This is Conspirinormal.
Welcome to Conspirinormal. This is Adam, and of course Serfiel's standing by. How's it going, buddy?
It's going okay. Pretty good. We got some very interesting people on the line with us today.
Yeah, we've got Carl Abrahamsson and we've got Vanessa Sinclair on the line, and they're joining us all the way from Stockholm, Sweden.
That's right.
So,
hi, nice to meet you.
Hello.
Nice to meet you guys. I think we're about like 6-7 hours difference, something like that.
Yep.
Yeah,
right
I think
now,
7.
So it's like early afternoon for us, and it's like late at night for you guys, or a little bit later at night for you guys.
Mm-hmm.
But Carl did a movie about Anton Lavey, a documentary. And this is a subject we kind of wanted to cover for a long time. And Carl and Vanessa, welcome to Conspirinormal.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so Carl, we'll start with you. I want to talk, and Serfiel will jump in with questions as well. But what made you want to make this documentary? What kind of like made you want to kind of explore this? I know that you knew Anton Lavey, so maybe we can kind of start there with kind of like your relationship with him, how you met him and all that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, it's been a long journey since the very first time, and that sort of it makes sense that I did this now. But if we jump back to the very beginning, it was mid 1980s. I was a young, curious person interested in occultism and weird pop culture and good music and good movies and all those things that one is interested in when one has that age. And of course, sooner or later, when you are interested in these things, you run into LaVey and his Satanic Bible, and I did, and it was so liberating in a way, because I really liked the book compared to a lot of other occult stuff that was considerably more complicated and highbrow, and you just filled with symbols, whereas LaVey had that, he was what I call a punch packer. He packed the punch. It's not because it was simplistic, rather on the contrary, kind of complex ideas and concepts, but the way he formulated it really appealed to me. And I also liked the symbol of Satan as some kind of, not as a anthropomorphic thing, but as a symbol of resistance, as a symbol of a friend of humanity who wants, who supports people to be ingenious and creative and go against the grain, all these things that appeal to a teenager. And basically, then I had a band, because that's also something you do. And that band, the first record we made was a song called Sweet Jane, and it was my own romanticizing about LaVey's relationship with the movie star Jane Mansfield, because I was like obsessed with that kind of lore where occultism and pop culture, or B-movies and great music, all of these things merge. And this was like a real scenario. This really happened, even though for me at that time was like larger than life. And then I had a friend who had met LaVey, an English musician and artist called Vanessa P-Orridge, and he said, "Why don't you send that record to him? I'm sure he would like that." And I did, and I knew for a fact that he didn't like rock and roll, that kind of stuff, and this was kind of noisy rock and roll record. But I did, and lo and behold, I did get a letter back from him expressing his gratitude for keeping the faith and the memory of Jane and stuff like that. And then this was in the record came out in 1987. Then I got the letter after having sent it in 1988. And then in 1989, I went on my first ever American trip, and that's when I met LaVey and we became friends. And then almost every year after that, up until the mid-1990s, I went to see him in San Francisco. We hung out and just did normal things that friends do, in the sense that we were both, movie buffs. So we watched a lot of movies, listened to him play his weird music. And it was just great to hang out there. Very inspiring for me. And then what happened was that, time passes, and he died in 1997, and I had translated and published the Satanic Bible into Swedish in 1996. So I was happy about that he could see that at least. And then, time passes on, life, etc., etc. Then about, when was that? 4 years ago, I started working on a book called California Infernal, containing old photographs by a paparazzo called Walter Fisher. And it was all these photographs of LaVey with Jane Mansfield, but also LaVey alone with Forry Ackerman. It was just amazing photographs. And it dawned on me that maybe this is like fodder for a film, because I'm a filmmaker, and I had this burning question in my mind, I felt like I had been, knocked on the head whenever I came out of the Black House early in the morning. And I mean that in a good way. I was like knocked over by impressions and inspiration and just wonderful impressions. And I was curious about the people that I met back then, but also other people that I knew were there at about the same time, whether they felt the same thing that, LaVey had in a way, I wouldn't say programmed us, but, given us so much inspiration and thematic possibilities that we took them on and made them real and manifest in our lives, and that filled us with joy. I certainly, took many impressions from those experiences, and they have been very valuable to me in my creative life. And then I started, networking again and talking to people, and one thing led to another. So I just, I went with Vanessa, and we met these people, old friends and new friends, and started shooting material, and that turned into the film Into the Devil's Den.
Mm-hmm. And you really point out that this was about your experience and other people's experiences. You really didn't want to make a biopic about LaVey. You said, I think a few times, that you almost had you almost thought about it, but you thought you'd keep it more personal.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was a decision, a multi-layered or multifaceted decision. First of all, the question was mine. The sort of the instigating question was mine. The premise of the film is, I experienced this. What did other people experience? So the step to a biopic from that is very, very, very long. And then also in terms of aesthetics, I like to watch documentaries that have, the personal touch. I'm not interested in like generic documentaries that are basically like they use a TV formula. If you have someone saying something, then you have to counteract with someone with an opposing, opinion, stuff like that, to have some kind of objective journalistic balance. That's great for TV and news and stuff like that. But I want emotion in documentaries, and specifically in my own. I want personal approaches. I want emotion, and I want it to be heartfelt. And in that sense, it wasn't really a hard decision for me to leave this kind of ambitious biopic thing. Just focus on the premise. And the premise is what I experienced there, what filled me with joy and inspiration. Was that also the case with other people? And as it turned out, it was.
And LaVey's influence on culture, and you really point out magic too, really can't be underestimated. And that same impact that he had on you, he had the same impact on a lot of other very influential people in culture, and things I think still reverberate to this day.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that will just keep on. It will keep on doing that through the fact that his books are still out there, and there are new books being written, and it's just that the sad thing is, of course, that there's no more. Since he's dead, he can't formulate himself onwards. But I mean, the stuff that's already there I think it's brilliant, and I see myself as some kind of magical anthropologist in a way. I've studied a lot of things in theory and also in practice, and checked out different things, different traditions and stuff like that. And what made him so valuable in the big picture, and what will continue to be valuable, is the fact that he left this arcane system, the Western ceremonial traditional, magic stuff with the certain kind of ceremonies and rituals, and he sort of wove in the demonic, but he also wove in from stuff from movies and his music, and it was just a completely new ball game in the way that he used magical memes in a way to as ingredients in his own concoction, and then he offered the concoction saying exactly what it was. No, essentially no hocus pocus, in the sense that no obfuscating magical terminologies that people, were confused by, but rather a pragmatic approach saying, try to do this and see what it does for you, but make sure to keep the language your own. Weave in your own magical memes based on what really makes you resonate. And that's another aspect that I like. It's very much about emotion. It's not so cerebral as much of the other magical systems, so much of the other magical systems on the market, so to speak. Because the more system you have, of course, the longer it'll take for you to get to the core. And to the core of what? Well, to the core of yourself, of course. And for LaVey, it was more like a holding up a mirror to people, saying that this is a dark mirror. This is created by people who like sort of dark music and powerful stuff and emotional stuff. Take a look at yourself in it. If you find a resonance, that's beautiful. But if you don't, just shuffle on and move on to something else. There was no real, there wasn't any sense of trying to pull people in and, milk them or obfuscate their own real desire, which is always for people to find out more about themselves, and aesthetics and culture is a great gateway of doing that. It's easier for people to relate to something that they already know and feel a resonance with than escapistically confine themselves in a symbology that may not have any meaning for them eventually.
Well, I want to ask you, Carl, about LaVey and his kind of like his life as a showman, being kind of like a carny, and how that really kind of influenced him and what he later did, and kind of what some of the ideas that he picked up doing that kind of job would filtrate down into what he would later call the Church of Satan.
Well, I think it basically has to do with, getting to know the human psyche. LaVey was very interested in psychology. I mean, later on in his life, he was, well versed in psychology, and he says in the film that, he's a Freudian, and that's great, But I think what when he was young and he traveled with circus and sideshow, that's basically a world of make believe in a way, but at the same time, it's very real. People who are soothsayers or read people's future in the cards or whatever technique they use. It's basically a cold reading, saying that this person seems a bit distraught. He or she needs to hear this to be a bit pepped. And everybody knows it's a game. No one goes to a sideshow, and thinks that it will change their life for a substantial better. It's games, and it's fun, and it's there's enchantment and arousal, and it's really a kind of an escapistic bubble in the lives of ordinary Americans, or at least it used to be. So I think what LaVey got to see there was both the best sides of the human psyche, but also the worst side, a great deal of hypocrisy. Like he mentions that many of the people who went to the girly shows in the morning after were at the congregation for some church that traveled with the sideshow. So it's all about show business in a way. And I think that what he took away from that was basically a deep and realistic knowledge of how the human mind works and how the human psyche works. And that I think he took on, not, specifically cynically to create something that could, milk people, but just knowing that some people may say that humans are noble, or they'd have, Christian potential or whatever. He had seen the worst of people and knew how hypocritical people usually are. So for him, it was no problem stripping that in his own system of LaVeyan Satanism. He just wanted people who were resonating and who could feel empowered by hearing the truth. And the truth in this case was just basically self-reflection, to be honest when you're self-reflecting.
Vanessa, I wanted to get you in here about this being a psychoanalyst and kind of like get your insights on what Carl just said about LaVey and how was LaVey kind of right about those ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually told Carl, I think at some point we need to write a paper about psychoanalysis and Satanism, because I see a lot of parallels in that, it's about that there's like no like right or wrong path for everyone, that everyone's an individual and has their kind of individual trajectories, and that there's so many different things that influence each individual, that you can't just like boil everyone down to these categories that have historically people have tried to put each other in. It's like I think they both of them celebrate the individual. And like in psychoanalysis and a psychoanalytic treatment, the difference between psychoanalysis and like regular psychology is that if you see like kind of a regular therapist, sometimes people will give you advice on like what you can do to feel better and give you some like stress management techniques and like different ways of thinking. But a lot of times it's kind of prescriptive in that way, where the therapist has some answers and can help the patient, right? But a psychoanalyst doesn't take that position. In fact, like if you're asking the analyst to kind of tell you what to do, the analyst will refuse, because instead the point is for someone to actually not step in and tell you what to do and give you advice for once in your life and to help you figure out what you actually want.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like LaVey really emphasized self-discovery. He talked about, the things that are really important to you in your social and sexual development, the things that are really important to you as a child, the things that you gravitate towards, like hold those things really close and they can become your magical tools. Even though people see like the general aesthetics that was based on, his preferences, he didn't necessarily want everyone to have to be tied to that. You can still be, you can still resonate with Satanism and wear bright colors or be into the cultural things that impacted you.
Exactly. And it's harnessing those things that do like make you an individual really resonate with yourself. That's going to be what's powerful for you.
Carl, I've always been told that, LaVey basically was an atheist, but he used Satan as a kind of what we would now call like a trigger word. And so can you kind of talk about that, how he kind of used just the word Satan, how that kind of was to make people literally feel uncomfortable and then to get them out of their comfort zone as some kind of like, if they could get past that, then they could really get into the philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's the key to it, and that's usually what's called a bullshit detector. So it's not so much about keeping people out and off, because those people who might seem to have a semblance of intelligence or possibly a possible attraction, they might not if they are terrified by the symbol itself. And then there are degrees of that, and some people of course realize immediately that this is brilliant. He's using this simple word that is actually still quite a powerful symbol, specifically in Christian cultures, I'd say, and by doing that, sort of discard those who, by their own fear in a way, will never come to terms with that in themselves. However, the people who have no problem accepting it, they can start discussing in between themselves, terms and concepts and philosophical things and magical things. And it's like, de-dramatized. It's no longer a drama by existing in this environment. And I think it's very important what you said also, is that, he certainly didn't want people to look like him or act like him. It was all about, from a psychological perspective, becoming individuated and using symbols for reaction, but also for proaction is a powerful thing. Using religious icons and symbols that might not at all have been there in your own religious upbringing, whatever that is, but simply looking at the world pragmatically and seeing what made you tick early on in life, and then just roll with that, develop that. Everybody knows, for instance, how important like the first sexual experiences are in life and how they tend to format you in a way, and it sticks with you. And that's what LaVey called erotic crystallization, and that it's a very powerful moment because the forces involved there are very, very powerful. And I think we are also drifting now into something that is interesting, in the sense that people say that he was like a strict materialist. That may be the case. I can't speak for him, but I think earlier on in the history of the Church of Satan, there was certainly kind of an open-mindedness about the concept of magic. And magic, of course, it's very hard to define what it is. I mean, you could look at it as a cultural cluster, or a cluster in different cultures about how to relate to the supernatural, etc., etc. But if you talk about magic as a tool or a system of tools that has the potential to be useful for you in your own individuation process, whether it's elaborate rituals or whether it's just like thinking about these things, it's still something that we relegate to the sphere of the supernatural, and hence to the, in a way, non-materialistic, and that's when it becomes a bit dodgy. I do think definitely LaVey sort of believed, and that's believe in quotation marks, he believed in magic for sure, but he also made a distinction between lesser magic, which is day-to-day manipulations of the material world in a way, and higher magic, which is more of a psychological nature. And that's also one way of describing these things, is to use a psychological language. Our so-called sciences have not really reached that point yet where they validate these concepts. But he certainly did, and he just preferred to call it like lesser magic. It's the simple stuff, and higher, greater magic is something else that we cannot explain. And that doesn't mean that it's materialistic. It doesn't mean that his approach was non-materialistic. So I can't really speak for him, but my sense, even when I met him, which was towards the end of his life, was that he certainly believed in magic. But then again, what is it? Is it just something natural rather than supernatural, or is it just like psychological hocus pocus? I really don't know.
Well, and then for people who would discount LaVey, I mean, you do a really good job in your Occulture book. You have a chapter, chapter 9, Anton Lavey, Magical Innovator, where you also talk about how much he influenced magic itself, and how these techniques that he really introduced into magic he integrated emotion and things that made it a lot more powerful to a lot of people.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I'm very happy about that text. And I would say that writing that text was also something that made me think a lot about the concepts that eventually turned into the film also. And it's just very basic stuff. It's just like validating core human processes. Whereas the history of magic, say for instance during the 20th century, was one of syncretism in the beginning, weaving in elements from the East and Asian philosophies and schools, and then it just moves on and on, and we have Crowley there, and we have Austin Spare there, and then a strong influx still from the Golden Dawn, which is basically Western ceremonial magic with a huge Kabbalistic influx. And then came the 60s with the Age of Aquarius and all the Eastern stuff. But still, they were all systems. They were all systems based on the individual getting into a structure or a group or a collective thing. So even if you have a philosophy that claims to be, liberating for the individual, it still comes at a high price, which is that you have to sort of succumb or subordinate yourself into a system. And that, I think,
Right.
if anything, what the 60s brought was something that was really healthy against that kind of collectivistic thinking. And LaVey was part of that too, albeit in darker colors in a way.
Mhm.
And what he brought to the table was simply this thing, don't listen to anyone, don't listen to anything except for what makes you tick, what makes you happy, what makes you, feel resonant with the stimulus in question. So I think that it's easy to say that, but he actually walked the talk. He came up with these concepts and told people, this is how I perform magic. And then people could take it or leave it. So there was a sense of honesty there too, and I think it was healthy. I mean, it was great for me to have experienced it, and great for other people too. He was just a great, larger than life character. But at the same time, if we stick with the perspective of looking at the history of magic, he was really a game changer, more so than I think people have given him credit for. But I intend to keep changing that so that more people realize it, because magic today is like an explosive game board filled with potential, and if you're stuck in the Kabbalah or ceremonial magic, you're going to lose out. you're going to miss the big picture and all the fun.
Well, and so much of that stuff was so culturally specific, and LaVey really looks like he created a system that is very very modern, where people can use the material around them and their modern day cultures and even pop culture and things to do magic. So I'd like to step back a little bit and just talk about how both of you all are very interested in magic and the occult, its role in society and history. You both research and explore these themes in different ways. Vanessa is a psychoanalyst. And for both of you also, artistic expression and creation seems to be at the center of your own personal relation to magic. And I want to kind of talk about that dynamic and how you all have these rich intellectual lives and rich artistic and magical lives. And it seems like there's not a big separation between the two, and that they have communication with each other.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely all go together. I think that the best art is magical and it's charged in some way. And, every time I'm doing a working, I mean, most of my art is a working, leftovers from a working that I've done, basically. So when I'm doing like cut-ups and collages, they're either infused with some intention or me just exploring, but there's always kind of a magical mindset when they're being created.
And you're very influenced by the cut-up method in particular, right?
Yes. I do cut-ups almost every day for years now. And yeah, I have, when I lived in New York, I was friends and roommates with a woman named Caitlin Foisey, who's also a witch and artist. And we kind of had a third mind project going on while we lived together there, very much in the vein of William Burroughs and Brian Geisen. And we had both been doing cut-ups and witchcraft on our own, separately, and had been friends for a while. And then one day we used to go to cemeteries together, as you do. And one day we were going to Harry Houdini's cemetery together, which was like our favorite spot to, hang out, basically. And we realized, we're not just talking about cut-ups and like talking about Burroughs and Geisen anymore, but now we're starting to understand what this kind of third mind that they were talking about is really about. And it was after like working together for a while. We didn't do it intentionally, but we started seeing how what they talk about, where like when two artists or magicians come together and work together for a period, then there becomes this kind of third mind that's not either of you, but made up of both of you. And it kind of takes on a life of its own. And and it's still, even though we live in different continents now, Caitlin is always in my thoughts, and I constantly am finding myself doing work that seems relevant to our project still, even when I don't mean to be. So it seems to still have a life of its own, and it's been really fascinating. And of course, as Carl mentioned earlier, Genesis P-Orridge and Jen's wife, Lady J, Breyer P-Orridge, they had a third mind project as well that they turned into their Pandrogyny project. So we're very much in that same sort of lineage from Burroughs and Geisen to Jen and Jay.
And then, Carl, do you want to talk about the role of magic in your music creation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have the same kind of approach, meaning that I can't really separate myself from what I do creatively. That may be quite common for many artists, and I think that's a good thing. But I also cannot separate myself from looking at, or not even looking at, but regarding the art as magic, meaning that everything, I cannot simply disseminate something that is just an expression. There needs to be something inherently, I wouldn't say strategic. It could be an expression in the sense that something I need to get out of my system, for instance. That's not necessarily going somewhere in space and time, but it's just like a cleansing or something hygienic in a way. But everything I do in terms of writing or music or that in combo as some kind of spoken word musical piece, or the films also, it's imbued with intent. I don't think I could ever do something. It would feel kind of pointless for me to just be all round creative, in the sense like doodling on a piece of paper or making a drawing or a nice watercolor of the forest or something. I don't know, right, but it's just the way I've in a way programmed myself over the decades to be in a way efficient, but also to find my own methodology, to find my own language. And I think what I've been doing recently in terms of music and this combination with spoken word stuff sort of sums that up in a way. There is the written aspect, there is the oral aspect in the sense that I'm reading it, so it's kind of like a spell, but the spell is also woven into the creative process of music that is created to create, to achieve or generate an emotional response in the person who's hopefully listening to it, and they don't need to listen to it like with full attention. It is, after all, some kind of ambient music. But I do strongly believe in what used to be called the butterfly effect, meaning that whatever I say now, it will resound in theory forever, and then with music and stuff, if people listen to it in other places and it's amplified and sent out into their spaces, and it's just an interesting it creates for an interesting magical resonance, basically of infinite potential. The more widespread it becomes, and the more people get involved with listening to and reading our stuff and watching the films and stuff like that. It's like a platform of engagement and communication that's very, very interesting.
I was just gonna say, and then we've had these couple conferences together, and hopefully we'll have more, since you mentioned the intellectual kind of aspect of it as well.
Yeah.
Where we've brought together like psychoanalysts, artists, and occultists and magicians, all in the same room. And those have been really amazing too, because it's kind of a dream come true for me, because these are all like the different kind of fields that I study and work in and read, and then to have like kind of all my favorite magical practitioners and psychoanalysts and artists in the same room talking to each other has been really amazing. And I made sure, like, when I developed the panels, like, instead of grouping them by topic, because then you'd have like all the analysts on one and like all the shamans on another. I actually like made the panels by cut-ups. I put everybody's like name in a hat and then pulled them out randomly to see like who would end up together. And It put together people that I would never have imagined talking. And I was like, great, let's do that. So it really led to like great conversations. And then now they've things, new books and art. And so then we get to enjoy that. So
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that conference. because I watched that interview last night when you guys were like a month out from doing it. So how did that go to have these people from kind of different disciplines? Did they find some similarities with each other? Just like how, like, were people really, and the way that you did that, how did the conversations kind of flow? What did people, were there any conclusions? What did you guys get out of that?
I mean, they everybody definitely got along, and I think, I think, of course, like, the analysts are probably the most closed-minded because they're not used to talking to artists and, like, shamanic practitioners, but they were all open-minded enough analysts to come to the conference, you know, so we already, like, had a good group, you know. Yeah, like, at one point I remember one analyst coming up and being like, because, you know, we had people talking about just, like, really different, like, kind of worldviews that are not the, you know, Western academic worldview. And they were like, we've never, you know, they'd never even heard of any of this before. So they were kind of like, we don't know what to make of it. And we feel really, like, nervous but excited, but we think that's good, you know? Like, yeah, I think that's good too. But they ended up, like, definitely finding common ground, and that's why I wanted to bring them together, because I feel like everybody's kind of working. I mean, everyone's working with consciousness and, you know, the mind and life and creativity, and I felt like they all had a lot more in common than they realized. And I especially wanted to break into academia and kind of break down those walls a little bit, because it's definitely, you know, it's so taboo. It's like, you talk about magic or shamanism in academia, it's like, oh, you study that, you know, it's kind of, like, automatically written off. Which, of course, my point to them is, like, you know, that's really racist at the end of the day. And you can't do that, you know, you can't do that anymore. You have to stop. So I think that's starting to change finally.
Yeah. And psychoanalysis is so disparaged by the psychiatric and psychological establishment, you know, more that it can't replicate the same prejudices.
Exactly. And also, you know, Freud was interested in the occult when he was starting out. And, you know, he made a conscious choice in the beginning to kind of move away from that because he was trying to make his new science legitimate. But he's still, like, there's still letters that he wrote where he was still doing, like, telepathy experiments and stuff, like, way into, like, the end of the 1920s. So he did it, like, you know, way into his, like, 70s. So, you know, he was always interested in it. He just was trying to, like, make his way in a I mean, we think the medical establishment is hard-headed now. Imagine it was like in, you know, 1895. You know, he made to be kind of taken seriously, but I'm wanting to, like, bridge those divides again because I think they're really unnecessary and just keeping all the fields back.
Absolutely. I listened to your lecture, The Crusade Against Magical Thinking, and I really like that. I really like how you're stressing that, like, psychoanalysis should help by acknowledging magical thinking to combat those in the psychological psychiatric establishment who are always trying to pathologize it. And how the prejudice against magical thinking in the West, you said it belittles people's belief and trust in their own ability and experiences, and I think that's really good work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's really true because, you know, when I was training as a psychologist, you're taught, you know, if somebody talks to their dead grandmother, you know, that they're on a road to psychosis. And it's like, once I had a private practice for long enough, it's like literally every single person that comes into my office at one point is like, oh, I know this sounds crazy, but, and they talk about, like, some synchronicity, like, oh, I was on the train and then this thing happened and this number means this to me, or they do have an ancestor that they feel close to that is dead. You know, like, literally every single person that has ever talked to me has something like that they've brought up at some point. And everyone's so afraid to talk about it because they're afraid that they're going to be pathologized. But it's like, if literally something like this happens to nearly everyone I've ever met, then probably it's pretty common, you know? Maybe we should stop pathologizing these things. And then there's this great analyst out of England named Darian Leader, who is also a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book called What is Madness? And that's what he talks about. He's like, the Western medicine and psychiatry in particular has pathologized just having different belief systems, and depending on who the medical doctors and psychiatrists decide is a valid belief system or that society thinks is valid depends on who's pathologized. And like, just because, I mean, someone could have a totally different point of view, or like he talks about one of his patients that like believed he was from some other planet, and it's like, so what? Like, why does it matter? Some people believe in Jesus, they're not put into padded rooms. So, like, why is somebody that believes he's from another planet put in one? If he can function fine, he's feeling happy, he can go to work or have friends or whatever. Like, what's the problem? The only time that somebody should need help is if they feel like there's a problem and they want help. But if they're fine, then, like, why should we be bothering them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting. Carl, I want to turn to you refer to yourself as kind of like a magical anthropologist, and I've been reading your book Occulture, and you really stress how in analyzing these different movements in the occult or magic, how these movements have seeds of later cultural developments. And so like you go through, you talk about the Lebensreform in Germany that really like foretold so much of what we think of like the hippies, the new age nowadays. You talk about LaVey, of course, and then Temple of Psychic Youth. And can you kind of explain that idea of a culture and how the rest of the larger dominant culture has been so influenced by things that first happened in the occult?
Sure, absolutely. It's if you look at, I think that book focuses a lot on the 20th century because undoubtedly it was a very, very dramatic century that we were basically in the aftermath of it, and again, this what I mentioned earlier on, this syncretism where there was like things melting into each other and merging into each other and then taking on new forms, and some became extinct more or less immediately, and other caught on and seeped into the mainstream and became something very, very substantial, and that in itself was like subdivided, usually after power tripping conflicts, into smaller groups again, but they kept some kind of flame going. It seems that when there is no major draconian force, like for instance a monotheistic clutch on the public arena, people become very creative. And that's not saying people can't be creative under stress and duress and restraint, because they can. But when you have an all-round freedom and you have traumatic experiences like the world wars and pandemics and the atomic bomb and things like that, that awakens things in people's psyche, and also in the collective psyche, that whoa, this is beyond human on human aggression. This is something that carries a very, very negative potential for me, even though it's other people deciding what's going to happen. So I think a lot of what we saw during the 20th century is basically a kind of elaborate and chaotic survival instinct, taking the form of some people waking up, being imbued with a message saying, hey, people, listen up, this is very, very wrong, this is crazy. Most of them, just like, in the saying, if the nail sticks up too high, it will be hammered down. But many nails are resilient, and they will just keep standing, and suddenly there are 2 nails and 3 nails, and then it becomes something else. And what happened in the esoteric environment, say for instance at the turn of the previous century, was that there was this kind of disdain against the strictly materialistic worldview brought on by the 19th century imperialism and industrialism and all these things. So of course the pendulum swings into the other way, and you have seances and spiritism and occultism in general. And what happened during the 20th century was that it seems that the pendulum is swinging so fast that no one really sees it anymore, because you have very extreme movements on both sides, and we'll just see where that ends up. But people no longer use a language of, let's call it religion or pseudo-religion. They can use other things to reach out to people, meaning they use culture. So if some interesting little people in a group or just singular people are creative and they can get their creative work out there to inspire people, because that's how it all begins, it's by inspiration, then an idea could catch on, whether, for instance, it's disseminated in a mainstream movie or in a successful novel. That affects people a lot more than political decisions. Politics should really be about administering reality, but how reality is created in the human psyche is by signals and input that is basically non-rational. So it's emotional, it's concepts. And when many people find that, whoa, you like this book too, you like this film too, you like this writer too, that can really create change. And that's really what happened, in the sense that many of the Lebensreform, original Lebensreform people from Germany actually emigrated to the US and ended up in California and Arizona and became this old generation, proto-generation of hippies that the young hippies looked up to. So that's a very concrete strain of not just how an idea travels by default or by proxy, but through real human interaction. But then, of course, when thousands of people get turned on, in this case by Leary and Kesey and his people, then it was kind of like an explosion of a philosophical attitude that was dropped straight down into the individual's psyche. And that's interesting as a phenomenon, but it's more interesting what happened later on, when sort of the multicolored veil was taken away by a rude awakening of the Vietnam War and harsher climates and stuff like that. Basically, in many people, these ideas of individual liberty and free love and tolerance, a kind of a holistic approach towards the earth and eating better and respecting animals, it turned into movements where people actually got together and worked with it, and that became like civil rights. It became equality for women and environmental awareness, all these things, and basically stemming from very individual seed of people willing to take the risk to stand outside of a collective and also to express what they found, sharing the information. And it may sound sort of banal, but that's really how things change. It's how human processes and major creative movements actually work, and how things change in the big picture. And it's only when you have a collective movement that's when the real problems begin, because human beings are inherently power tripping. It's something, biologically ingrained in us. So even when you have a movement that carries something objectively good, meaning something altruistic, meaning something good for the environment or the awareness of things, it will eventually end up sour, simply because there are people involved, and power is a very corrupting phenomenon. But then again, as I said, then things split up and they go into different strains, and some are purists to the left and other are purists to the right, and some are purists in the center, but most of them still carry some of the original seed, and it would just take on different forms, mutate. Ideas are like DNA in a way. Just they will live on in different forms.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about, because I've definitely have noticed myself in many ways, because since I've done this show, getting a lot of people that are interested in occultism. What do you think is behind the latest flowering of it?
Well, if you're asking me, I have a very concrete answer there. I think, as with what began already in the early 20th century or late 19th century, it's about survival. We are living in extremely chaotic times, and people are very, very afraid of making decisions on their own. So they look to, secure environments, stable things. But at the same time, they also associate these traditional stable things with corruption, with transgression, with negative things. So people people are trying to be open-minded simply in order to survive, to find new avenues, to find new ways of not only thinking and feeling, fulfilled by the theory and inspiration, but actually ways of moving ahead, alone, but also together. And even in the big picture, I mean, we're looking at that right now because we're in this pandemic thing. I think it would be a very problematic situation if each country had isolated itself even in terms of communication. That would create a very difficult situation. But now people have to communicate. They have to be transparent and honest. And this is, I've never experienced anything so concrete. This is about survival. Mm-hmm. And if you don't harness this, the virus or pandemic, it will mutate. It will come back in a more vicious form because it's also struggling for survival, just as we are. And we have been very complacent in the sense that, we're living, we're well off and, we're living complacent, nice lives and can watch our big screen TVs and stuff like that. But in general, we're geared at surviving. And that's what's being awakened right now. It's just cry for help, directed towards ourselves and to our closest people. But we are not isolated in that sense, especially now with the internet. We can just, talk about these things and say that let's try what these old shamanic people in the Amazon or in Australia or wherever, how are they relating to the planet and to survival? Because our strategies that we have in the West, they don't seem to be working out so well. So I think it's time to open up and let some perhaps esoteric or magical influx in, but to validate what's worked all along. And our way of dealing with problems is basically a couple of 100 years old, I'd say. It comes with industrialization and imperialism, and it's materialism cloaked in a monotheistic garb, and it's a horrible thing. It's extremely destructive, and it cannot go on forever because then we will all be the victims. So that's the reason why I think people are so interested in occultism, in esoteric things, in alternatives, basically.
Vanessa, do you have a psychoanalytical view of that?
Yeah,
the current occult revival?
I think it gives. I agree with Carl, and I also think it returns people's agency back to them. Like we were saying before with the crusade against magical thinking. It's like people have experiences, and they're taught by society that their internal experiences are wrong or crazy, and that they should listen to what this outside authority tells them is the correct way to be or think or interact with the world. And I think that we're seeing a revival of kind of occult thinking and different shamanic practices, magical practices, because it returns people's agency to them. And it also, at the very least, I always think about working with your ancestors, because everybody has ancestors. Everybody has people that came before them. And I think we need to return to, instead of pathologizing people who are connected with their ancestors, return to like working with your ancestors and your lineage, because there's always power in that. And also into working with the land that you're on, especially in the United States. It's so people are so disconnected from the land because the people that originally inhabited the land were just massacred and put on these little reservations, and they're so totally pushed to the side, and there's no respect for the land, there's no respect for the earth. And I think it is a survival strategy for the earth and nature, and for ourselves, which we are part of the earth and nature, and we need to stop.
Very interesting. Yeah, and another, we talked about LaVey earlier, but another one of the biggest iconoclasts of the late 20th century, and someone you both were acquainted and friends with, was Genesis P-Orridge, of course, who just passed recently. And I understand your latest project, Carl, was a collection of collaborations with Genesis over a few decades, or?
Yeah, absolutely. It's you're referring to the book called Sacred Intent, which came out just in time for Jen to receive his copies, and then he passed. And it was we knew that the end was near, so to speak. So we really worked on the book a lot and made sure it came out in time for Jen to experience that. It's basically a book that gathers sums up conversations that we had beginning in 1986 and up until 2019. So it's a pretty long haul. Of course, we talked about a lot of interesting things also outside of this sort of concept of having an interview. But we decided, I think, in the year 2000 to let's make this right. Let's make actual interviews for a book in the future, because otherwise it's just like two people talking about interesting things, but what good is that for other people if you can't share it in a way? So I'm very happy we did that, and I wish we had done more in a way, because I'm very happy with how the book is, and it's getting a really good response in the sense that people associate Genesis with music, like radical music, Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV and stuff like that, and that's all fair and fine, and also Jen as an artist. But for me, Jen was first and foremost a magician, and sometimes the discussions are more about art and these things, project. But what I'm happy with that sort of seeps through is this sacred intent. Jen talked about sacred intent, meaning, as we touched upon that before too, is like everything needs to have some kind of seed to be moved on into the future, into the possibility of reaching fertile soil in someone else's mind, and it's a project that is hard to even look at and not be emotional about it, because in the last chapter, for instance, Jen asked me, what do you think it will be like, a world without Jen in it? And then I just said that, it'll be fine, it'll just deal with things and we'll carry on the torch, whatever, Right. But that's a rational way of looking at it. But now, of course, after the fact, it becomes much more of an emotional thing. And I, for now, feel that with the music that we've made together and this book and other projects, it's just to not only carry on the intellectual legacy, but also the magical legacy. How we first met was under the umbrella of the Temple of Psychic Youth, and there's so much there that's still not processed yet by me. So I'm going to carry on with that for sure and make sure that's moved forward in a sense, so that the magical legacy is also kept alive, just as the intellectual or the artistic is through this book.
Well, the Temple of Psychic Youth seems to be one of these like occult breeding grounds that really influenced our present day. Along with, I could see LaVey's influence too, but the Temple of Psychic Youth, can you kind of talk about how much influence you see that you all created back then, and what your part in it was?
Yeah, I think that it sort of it was designed because Jen was very smart and saw the big picture immediately, having sort of analyzed and discarded, for instance, the music industry and its cynicism, but he knew that culture was the way to go. So the Temple of Psychic Youth sort of aimed straight for the jugular in terms of affecting things on the outside. It was also a process of magical training and getting to know yourself and all these sort of personal things. But in terms of having agency in the outside world, again, culture was there from the start, and was encouraged to be involved in publishing and music making and filmmaking and all these things. And of course, the language that brought, essentially at that time, using influence from the cut-ups and Burroughs and Geisen that Vanessa also talked about, using whatever technology was available and applying this cut-up approach. That was very influential. I remembered very much, at that time there was satellite TV, there was no cable, it was satellite TV, and you had MTV and this huge demand for music videos, basically promotional clips, and they became very, very freaky in the mid 1980s. And then at that time, Psychic TV had been doing a lot of experimental videos, I could see strains that emanated from psychic TV for sure, because many of the filmmakers that were involved went on to make music videos, for instance. And that's not only an aesthetic thing, but also a thematic thing, weaving in magical things, occult things, and the work of Derek Jarman is a good example also of someone who was really strong at the time, and he was not an active part of Topi, but he was certainly favorable, and he appears in some of the psychic TV films, for instance, and made some films for them. So I think that from that blast that happened for 10 years, the first era of Temple of Psychic Youth, it left a legacy in writing, in the publications, in music, but mainly through the people who are still making things today, carry on the thing, not in the same language, but doing really good work that still affects people.
Well, and they really took that. Seems like you all really took that punk DIY ethos a step further into magic, and there's kind of a continuity between that, and that's what's very interesting about Topi.
Yeah, absolutely, and also it's not a something that is you have to justify the DIY thing in the sense that you have to work on a really small budget, because what happens when you grow up and you become more and more, in a way, affluent or have more means or access to things, plus the fact that technology has changed in a miraculous way. So suddenly we're all sitting with these tools that are amazing. We can do amazing things, like basically make a low budget film that really looks pretty good. It works.
You can do so much more for so much less.
Absolutely, because back then it was really cut and paste. It was, scissors and glue. So 4-track Porta studio recorders and stuff. But now we can do much more, and we are doing much more. Many people are using the original inspiration and the thematics and just moving it on in very, very advanced forms, I'd say.
I think too that what Toby showed, and also this ties to LaVey too, is like that magic could be in anything that you do, like anything that's personal and powerful for you. So like I learned from Jen that sigils can be in songs, like I always thought of sigils as like taking a part of sentence and making an abstract design and charging the sigil, which Toby of course did as well. But then when I met Jen, then I'd be doing something somewhere, and then a certain song of Jen's would pop on, and I'd see the synchronicity with it, and I'd be like, oh. And I learned that there's power in your words, not just when you abstract them into sigil form visually, but also when you put them into songs and put them out in the world. And that's I when I was doing my cut-ups, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I started reading them aloud, like Carl said earlier, like little spells, and then I started recording myself reading my cut-up spells, and then I would put them on like an iTunes playlist and like shuffle the recordings of myself reading my cut-ups, and then make more cut-ups while I was doing that. And when I met Carl, I started sending him my cut-up poem readings, and then he started sending them to music, and now we have albums, and they kind of go out into the world that way. So I think whether you're interested in music or poetry or art or whatever you're interested in, film, you can make whatever you're already interested in work for you and be part of your magical practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wanted to turn a little bit back to LaVey, if you don't mind. I just wanted to hit a couple of things. Kind of like you talk about in the film, Carl, or you rather, some of the people that you interview talk about this book that he was criticized for. I guess it was called The Witch's Workshop, and that he was kind of criticized for not being, I guess, feminist enough, but it was probably, for a lot of people, the most feminist work that they'd ever read. So we can kind of talk about that.
Yeah. It was originally called The Complete Witch, and then it was reissued as The Satanic Witch. And that was based on him summarizing in writing thoughts and ideas that, of course, were conducive to his own pleasure, meaning they were like things that he liked to think about in terms of aesthetics and how women should be, etc., etc. But it was also based on the thing that you mentioned, like the Witch's Workshop, which which was he had these group meetings even before the Church of Satan was inaugurated in 1966. There was the Magic Circle and there was the Witches Workshop, basically kind of informal gatherings where he talked about magic and showed what he knew to people who were interested. So the Witches Workshop was revealing in the sense that this was at a time when feminism was catching on, and basically as an reactive movement, as an antithetical movement towards, old school patriarchal Americanism in a way. But he didn't like the fact that it also affected the distinctions between the sexes from an aesthetic point of view. He was very much an aesthete. And his imprint, his erotic crystallization came, of course, from the I would say early 40s and onwards, because he was born in 1930. So the movie stars of that time and people he saw in sideshows and places where they were like slightly chubby. There was an actress called Iris Adrian that was his favorite, and so they were really feminine. And at that time, men were really masculine. So of course he brought that along because that was his crystallization. So it might not have been certainly not politically correct even then, but when women were trying to liberate themselves by burning their bras, mid to late 60s and early 70s, LaVey came with this tome saying use a sexier bra instead, because what he wanted was to empower women to be powerful, to be able to seduce men or to get their way. It was not about becoming subservient to some kind of patriarchal archetype. It was becoming as much woman as possibly possible in order to reap the harvest of what the witch in question wants. So he was just trying with one language to empower women, and that is amplified by some voices in the film who realized this also. But of course, at the time, of course, he got slack because or flack or whatever it's called. At the time, it was so anathema in a way to say that women should be women. But the reason why he did it was very, very pro-feminist in a way. He wanted women not to be part of a collective movement. He wanted individual women to be powerful. And this is something that I think most girls go through in their teens, of course, a highly confusing period of time. But women learn early on what kind of charms they have and what the ball game is, and many of them just succumb to tradition and traditional roles, etc., or they get swayed away into the antithesis. But hopefully they will use what they have for a good magical purpose, just as men should do the same thing. And if there's strength in an attraction, that's just all much for the better. And I think that LaVey's book was very, like many of his books, they were concocted and conceptualized very, very intelligently, because of course that book got a lot of attention. It was like perfectly released, and I think the Satanic Witches that use it today use it not with like a nostalgic with nostalgic goggles, saying that they have to look like movie stars from the 40s. On the contrary, I think it empowers them to look at themselves in the mirror and say, what do I get off on? What is my power? What is my look? Basically meaning becoming more aware of who you are and how to impose agency in the outside world.
Well, and there's a lot of really interesting magical concepts in there that if you look beyond the archetypes that he's presenting in some of the formulas, you could apply to a lot of different things too.
Of course.
I haven't read it in quite some time, but there's a lot you could take away from that, even if you were not a satanic witch.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the beauty of his stuff. It's just filled with ideas. And, and many of the ideas, when I return to his books, it's like, whoa, I never seen this before. It's like it's just so packed with potential seed that you have to return from time and time again. It's very, very rich material.
Well,
And
something I want to say real quick was the Magic Circle. I remember seeing the list of the topics he was presenting, and it looked to me like it would have been the equivalent of a paranormal podcast,
Exactly.
back then in his living room.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Totally.
And I think I mean,
It's a good point.
For us, it's great, to have these podcasts, especially during these pandemic times, and the fact that you are in America and we're here in Sweden. But I mean, it was also pretty cool to be in that house, and I was privileged that I could be in that room, in that ritual chamber where they actually had those meetings. And I could just, imagine being a fly on the wall, and those things where people from all walks of life came in there, and he talked about, the vampires or werewolves or cannibalism or medieval occultism. It just must have been amazing.
There was one thing that stood out to me, and just to point out too, that he had like a lot of women, I guess, quote unquote followers and friends that were his secretaries or pretty much his right hand. He had no problem with them basically doing what he needed them to do, and are them being happy to do what out of their own free will. So he depended a lot on women.
Oh, very much so. And I don't know too much about sort of his upbringing and childhood and stuff like that, but I think that he was a ladies' man for sure. And he preferred it because he was very sort of like an alpha male guy, and sometimes they don't work so well together with other alpha guys. Whereas with women, it's a different ball game.
And kind of going back to culture and what he was influenced by, something that really struck me, some of the footage that I guess was towards the end of his life that you put in the film, where he talked about, you mentioned that he hated rock and roll, and
right.
that, that's the normal, the old satanic panic thing about the heavy metal and all this kind of stuff back in the 80s. But he said, like, well, you better hope that, the real satanic music is Liszt and Beethoven and Debussy and all these guys. So he was very much anyone that was like an independent artist, essentially someone that really was an iconoclast. He said that was satanic music.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes to show also that the wide spectrum of possible future inspiration that he can bring, because as when people think of it as it's heavy metal or it's black metal or it's death metal or it's any it's dark and it's dangerous and stuff like that, but basically he lived, again, he came from another generation, and he was so well versed in music. It was eerie. He could play tunes just straight from off the top of his head on request, and also his knowledge of classical music, for instance, was astounding. And then I had to teach myself to get into classical music. I mean, you can say that Mozart is nice, but when you really get into it, you realize that in a piece of music by, for instance, these people, Liszt, Debussy, Beethoven, Wagner, of course, you have such a wide range of emotions, and of course it's allowed a longer span. It could be a short piece, 15 minutes, or an entire opera it goes on for hours, but still there's some kind of emotional focus in it that simply doesn't exist in rock and roll of any kind. It's just like a blast of aggression or frustration or desire, which ties in with the fact that it is essentially teenage music. Right. It's the teenager expressing what's good or what's bad, whereas in classical music and the more constructed pieces of, for instance, contemporary classical or experimental music, you have so much more going on. And this kind of wealth of human emotion, LaVey was a spokesman is not the correct word, but he was very much a living example of what could be made possible by integrating that kind of emotional understanding.
I'm very interested in what the relationship of Genesis and LaVey was like, because they would seem to a lot of people to be so diametrically opposed. You know, I know LaVey's gotten pigeonholed as being really, you know, authoritarian. Of course, he's said a lot of things to make people think that. And then Genesis is, you know, seen as this like really libertarian type. How did their relationship work? Because that's something I haven't really heard.
Yeah, on the surface, I think many people see it as you did, but there is. I don't want to sound too, you know, Harry Potterish in a way, but there, I would say that for people in the magical community that are visible, like are iconic, there is a kind of, I wouldn't say solidarity, but there is a respect and a diplomatic approach. And Jen had met LaVey early on, earlier than me in the 1980s, and that was kind of fresh then, so it was mid 80s, and LaVey was actually very interested in what Topi were doing. I talked to him about that too, in the sense that it's a magical network, it's focusing strongly on the networking, just as the Church of Satan had done. And they got along well. Jen, of course, was a super individual, yet having an altruistic streak that later on turned into many other things. But they were, I would say they were more than acquaintances, maybe not best buddies, but that had more to do with geographical, generational differences, and not a basic difference in attitude, not at all. And Jan provided me with a recording of him and LaVey actually talking together, and it's highly interesting stuff. And I'm going to use it for an upcoming book project. So they had a relationship that also moved into the 90s. I remember Jen telling me that they met sort of in the mid 90s when LaVey was more ailing, but they still, you know, went to an all-night diner and had hamburgers and stuff like that with Jen and Lady J and Blanche. So it was there, and I think what I would call the real solidarity of real magicians. In the sense, you can always find common ground. You can always find things to talk about, because the archetype that you carry forward and the wisdom you're carrying forward is too precious to be wasted on any kind of conflict at all. And if there is any kind of conflict in between people who claim to be, you know, magicians and other magicians, they're usually not worth their salt.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's especially because they're both magicians that were interested in empowering individuals. You know, you could have magicians that are not so nice to each other if they're both like in competing factions where they want to be on top. You know what I mean? Right. They have their different kind of hierarchical groups that they're running. But both of these groups, the Church of Satan and Topi, were all about being a collective of individuals. And that was what's really important. So they had a similar vision in that way.
Well, and they both stressed sexual freedom so much too, which is really interesting, and definitely put them together. And in Into the Devil's Den, you make it a point to really show how much LaVey was a pioneer in stressing sexual freedom, in identity, and people doing what they want to do. And that's something that people don't understand as much about LaVey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's very, very important, if I could just sort of touch upon this, in the sense that what we're seeing now with identity politics and many of these things, it's again people who they seek affinity in a collective instead of really finding out who they are. And a kind of a confusion of identity is normal and necessary when you're young, but for it to grow into a movement that's sort of transgenerational, it can become a problematic era, because a problematic thing, because what happens if you realize that, well, now I know myself better, I am not what I thought I was, I am actually this, and then you're inside in a safe collective selling itself based on an antithetical position towards something else. So I think that, again, it's all about individualism. That was what LaVey was preaching. He wasn't preaching free love. He was preaching, true, honest, transparent approach for yourself. That's not exactly the same thing, to be what do you call it, licentious, or being active in too many fields simply because that's what the culture dictates or the group dictates. That's not the same as being true to yourself.
Yeah, I reread the Satanic Bible last year for its 50th anniversary. And yeah, because I hadn't realized that when I read it the first time, I don't know, 20 something years ago, that he does mention, very explicitly many times, like people should be very free in their sexuality, no matter what form that sexuality should take, and homosexuality, transsexuality, and he even mentions asexuality, and this is in 1969. And I taught a class at the New School on gender, sexuality, and perversion, and this is all like current age stuff. And this, then he wrote this 50 years ago, so he was really forward thinking,
ahead of his time. Very much so. Yeah. Vanessa, I wanted to ask you before we end here about your book, Rendering Unconscious. That you, I guess that it's kind of like a compendium.
Yeah, when I was in New York, I had kind of a psychoanalytic group because even though psychoanalysis is such a kind of obscure field in the field of mental health, it's kind of, there's not a lot of us, I guess. We're still all very divided up into our little camps of like, I like Freud, or I like Lacan, or I like Jung, or I like Klein, and, the different theorists. And like everybody sort of stays in their camps with like the theorists that they love the most. And the different theories don't speak to each other a lot, even within this like kind of really small field. And I found that really frustrating because I happen to read a lot of different analysts and like what lots of different analysts say. And we had formed this group that was kind of an eclectic group of psychoanalysts that were coming from all sorts of different theoretical orientations. And I guess when I left New York, I must miss them. And so I decided to make a book kind of everybody. And like our group, we would bring people in from Europe and South America and stuff to speak as well. So I basically invited everyone from this sort of psychoanalytic group in New York, and then all the other analysts I knew from different kind of events and conferences, mostly in New York, to kind of contribute to this book. And yeah, so there's like 50 people in it. And it's great. And then I also included a bunch of poetry as well, because before I left New York, I was doing these poetry events. And actually that's where the name Rendering Unconscious came from. It was a poetry event that I did at the Delancey in the Lower East Side. And then I decided that would probably be a good name for the book. And then when I was waiting for the book to come out after I'd finished editing it, I was kind of antsy for something to do. And so I decided to start interviewing people that were in the book, and made this podcast. And so that's kind of how the podcast started. And now, of course, it's grown and branched out. And now I'm just interviewing all the analysts I can find, basically, especially now that we're in quarantine, because everybody's home, so now everyone suddenly has time to talk on the podcast. So I'm doing like one every few weeks. It's like I think I did 4 this week. I'm trying to slow down a little, but we're actually a lot of interviews.
We're actually doing another show tonight.
Yeah, exactly. That's great.
Well, then you also founded a association of psychoanalysts, right? Called Das Unbehagen.
Yeah, that's the group. That's what we're called, Das Unbehagen. So Freud wrote a book called Das Unbehagen in Der Culture, which is translated as civilization and its discontent. And he basically talks about how like people are going to be dissatisfied constantly because we live in civilization. So we're always having to kind of repress our needs and desires in order to live with each other. So everyone's like, being a little depressed is just a normal state of being in a society, because there's just no other way around it. You're going to be a little anxious and depressed because you can't really do what you want, because we all have to be here together, and then that's better than like living in the woods or whatever in the wild. We decided that we were sort of discontent with the civilization of psychoanalysis, and so we made our own sort of little society.
not to go too much into it because I definitely want to do a full interview about this, but some of the stuff in the book isn't necessarily a psychoanalysis on an individual. It's a psychoanalysis on groups and kind of like group think. So you're looking at different, you're also delving into the world of politics, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's really eclectic. I kind of, because I get really tired with academia and like writing for journals. I actually decided not to write for journals anymore because I just am so tired of like having to justify everything I want to say and like over edit myself and having other people over edit me. Mm-hmm. And so I basically told everyone like, it doesn't have to be an academic formal paper. Just like write what you actually think and what you have to say. And I'll let you publish it the way you want, instead of you having to fit into some little format. So basically let everyone write about what they want. And some people, we were putting it together. I think we got the idea for it in 2017, like in January. So some people wanted to write about politics and the election, and somebody wrote about like riots that were happening and uprisings, and some people wanted to write about films. Somebody wrote about like Black Swan, Darren Aronofsky. So it's really eclectic in that way, where people were welcome to write about whatever was kind of on their mind.
Cool. Well, something I wanted to ask you both, probably our last question, would be, we talked about the role of magic and creative process, but is there a magical element to researching and writing and the more intellectual stuff? Do you have intuition and synchronicity that lead you to answers? Do you find anything like that in your research processes?
Yeah, I would say for sure, and I would say that's probably one of the reasons why I find this kind of over editing so frustrating, because I'm really tired of like it saddens me to watch these like really intelligent people have to like think so much about like who's gonna argue, what arguments people are gonna bring up against them, and have so much of their work be a defense. Like you might say this, but here I've already addressed this argument. People have to take up so much of their time and energy defending what they have to say before they even start saying what they actually have to say. And it might be the psychoanalyst in me, or the magician in me, or the artist in me. I don't know, maybe all three. But I really feel like, especially like say in psychoanalysis, I'll pick one. People learn about themselves through the act of speaking about themselves. And so much of my job is like helping people to stop censoring themselves, because they're so inundated with like the way they're supposed to be from their parents and society and their families and what people expect of them and their job, that they're constantly like, oh, maybe I didn't really mean that, or maybe that wasn't the right word, or maybe this, that, and they're constantly like censoring themselves and editing themselves. And it's just so sad to me. And it's like, it's okay to say something and then be like, say it differently next time you say it if you decided you wouldn't want to phrase it that way this time. But you shouldn't have to keep editing and censoring yourself like in real time all the time. You should just kind of learn as you go, and people should accept more that like people might contradict themselves. Theorists might contradict themselves. They might write something later that doesn't go with what they wrote 10 years earlier. Why? Because it's been 10 years. You should change what you think and say. So I really want to just have more of a platform for that. And I feel like definitely in my own research, following the kind of synchronicities and clues, like I would in magical thinking, really helps me kind of get to things faster and in a better way than if I was constantly second guessing myself or reading what I thought people would say I'm supposed to be reading and citing.
Yeah, and I can only sort of second that emotion or that point of view. So for me, there's no higher magic than the actual process of writing. I mean, the lore of magic and the hocus pocus and the romanticism of it, and it's just beautiful and absolutely usable in a creative process. But for me, just to start writing and then realizing that I'm sort of opening a tap. And it's not a tap to some, outer universe of forces or whatever. It's basically into my own psyche, and my psyche, the deepest strata, that's occult. It's hidden. But when I'm writing that process, regardless if I'm writing like factual, rational stuff or fiction or poetry, whatever it is, it's the same kind of joy. That's basically being in touch with whether it's a lower or a higher stratum, doesn't matter. It's just a different level of your own consciousness. And it's a beautiful thing that people have been striving for, reaching and touching since the dawn of time. In different ways. And I think that to integrate that state of mind is absolutely necessary for individual survival, for collective survival, and it should be encouraged. And the best way to encourage that is by being creative and inspiring other people. That's how I look at it.
Wow. Thanks a lot, guys. This was a great discussion. Really loved having you guys on.
Yes, very much
really
so.
Fun.
Thank you. Well, Vanessa, we'll start with you. Where can people find your podcast? Where can they find your book?
Sure. We have so many sites. The podcast is at renderingUnconscious.org. My main website is drvanessasinclair.net, drvanessasinclair.net, and that has links to the podcast and to art. My art's through the Tripart website, which is Carl's publishing company. We have a Patreon where, like, every Monday we talk about our magical practice, and all of the podcasts, all of our music, everything, all of our writing comes out there first. And we're currently writing a book together. Our first book that we're writing together. We're doing a chapter every 2 weeks, and kind of taking turns writing chapters in this sort of exquisite corpse style, where Carl wrote the first chapter, I wrote the second, and he wrote the third. The third comes out this Friday. So that's been fun, and that's on the Patreon too. Those are the main places, I'd say.
What is the book about?
The Rendering Unconscious. The fiction book. Well, it's a mystery. You have to see.
It's literally a mystery to us too.
Yeah, because when Carl started it, he wrote the first chapter, and we did it in true exquisite corpse style, where I didn't look at his chapter when I wrote my chapter. So my chapter is totally different than his chapter, and now he just wrote the third chapter. I haven't read it yet because he just finished it today. But I'm actually integrating cut-ups now of, like, the first 2 chapters in the next one I'm writing, so that things start kind of looping around in the text. So I don't know, it's a fun process that we've never done before.
So it's kind of a magical working in and of itself.
Yes, like everything we do. Yeah, and then the Rendering Unconscious book is at Tripart, and I also have a book of cut-up poetry called Switching Mirrors. It's at Tripart, and then we have music at Highbrow Lowlife.
Yeah, no, there's simply so much. And I think the best thing for people is to drvanessasinclair.net, and my main site is carlabrahamsson.com. But the best hub is definitely our Patreon, which is patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl, Vanessa23Carl, because that has everything basically. It's our preferred way of interacting on social media.
And where can people see Into the Devil's Den?
Well, that would be on my Vimeo on demand page. You go to vimeo.com and then search and go for the on demand thing, and then just search for Carl Abrahamsson or the title of the film, which is Anton Lavey, Into the Devil's Den.
Highly recommended.
Excellent. Yes, same. I recommend it as well. All right, guys, thank you so much. Stay on the line for us, and we are going to close out the show, and we'll be back on Conspirinormal. All right, guys, welcome back to Conspirinormal. That was a really good interview with Vanessa Sinclair and Carl Abrahamsson. I was pretty impressed by that. Sergio, this is somebody that you'd wanted to get on for a long time.
Yeah, I've been following his work for a long time, and like you said, he's like a magical anthropologist, and his being so close to LaVey and Genesis really gives an insider view, into the late 20th century occult world and its influence on the larger culture and pop culture too. So it's been really wanting to talk to him for a long time. It was great to finally meet him.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we got Vanessa in there as well, and we kind of got her take on things. Like they're very much like a kind of a power couple, man.
Absolutely.
You know, like they just like that's like relationship goals right there, brother. Is what that is. So yeah, but they got the trap art is their
that's
company.
Carl's publishing company, I believe.
It's Carl's, but she also publishes on there too. So yeah, it's pretty interesting that they work together so well. And so we kind of got to like her perspective on all this and talked to him. So that was a really good interview. I think I really want to try to get more into the weeds with both of them on some stuff.
Yeah, and that idea of being a researcher and an artist, or being a psychoanalyst and an artist, and a magician at the same time, that's really cool to me. And I guess we have some friends like that too. I'd say like Timothy Renner is like that.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Yeah.
And I think it makes for, I think being more intellectual makes for a better artist, and then being an artist probably makes for being a better intellectual too, or researcher.
Well, Renner talks a lot about Temple Psychic Youth. He knows a lot about Genesis P-Orridge and all that. I had heard of Throbbing Gristle, but I had never really heard of all that, and Genesis P-Orridge, but I never knew any of the details about it till you started telling me about him. Or there's what was the Pandergene project? What was that?
The Pandergene project was basically you have this idea that came from like Burroughs and Brian Geison's collaborations called the Third Mind. I think Vanessa touched on that. That idea of that in your interaction with another person, you're kind of your interaction is creating this third thing, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, being on some kind of level. But the Pandergene project was with Genesis and his wife, Lady Jane, where they would actually become the same person together through plastic surgery and changing their gender identities.
Interesting.
And so she did things to augment her, he did things to augment himself, and it's their project was to like actually create that third mind in a physical manifestation of some kind of alchemical working.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, guys, we want to thank you for listening to the show. The usual spiel I will give out. Patreon. We're doing a Patreon every week, and it looks like it's working. People are really responding to that.
Cool.
People are joining up. And remember, guys, at the $1 level, if you can, that's what you get everything. If you can leave a little more, that would really help us out. We are going to be making some changes as far as like servers pretty soon. That's probably already going to happen by the time this show is out. So there's some
Just
great
Google.
things. Yes, there's some great things happening. So guys, we want to thank you for your support, but it really does help us, and it really does help us continue to do the show. And YouTube subscriptions, we just passed 1,000, which is really great. We want to thank everybody that has done that, taking the time to click that subscribe button on YouTube. And iTunes reviews are always great. We read a really positive one on the show. Just keep more of those coming. We know that things are growing, things are happening, and we want to thank you guys for listening to the show. All right, guys, we will be back next time with more. What would you even describe what we do anymore? I don't even know. Paranormal weirdness? I don't even know. It's gotten really complicated lately. So, guys, I want to thank you for listening, and we will be back next time on Conspirinormal.
you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel.